Welcome to Galaxy Brains.
An infinite amount of cash.
I'm your host, Alex Thorn.
The U.S. banking system is sound and resilient.
Bitcoin made a new all-time high.
If you're not long, you're short.
Satoshi's going to come on there, laugh hysterically, go quiet. All Bitcoin's going to be erased.
Bitcoin's the best crypto out there.
Bitcoin is going to zero.
Welcome back to Galaxy Brains. As always, I'm your host, Alex Thorn, head of firm-wide research at Galaxy. Bitcoin not zero, and we have a great episode for you today. Preston Pysh, host of the Bitcoin Fundamentals podcast, GP at Ego Death Capital, is our guest. We'll talk with Preston about a whole host of Bitcoin stuff, the Strategic Bitcoin Reserve, what it means that governments are getting involved in Bitcoin, how Bitcoin adoption looks at the retail and institutional levels, what he expects for Bitcoin, why Bitcoin is important for the world. It's a really fun interview with Preston. We'll also talk with our good friend Beimnet Abebe from Galaxy Trading, as always, to talk about markets. Big day today, Fed Day. Federal Reserve keeping rates flat. Are we entering stagflation? Things look a bit tricky out there, even though Bitcoin's holding in the 85K level. We'll get into it with Beimnet. And before I get to that, I need to remind you to please refer to the link to the disclaimer in the podcast notes and note that none of the information in this podcast constitutes investment advice or an offer, recommendation, or solicitation by Galaxy or any of its affiliates to buy or sell any securities. A lot of people not sure what's going on out here in markets, a lot of political and geopolitical uncertainty, economic uncertainty. The Fed basically saying that we're in stagflation, which is a very tricky place to be. I don't know. We're going to talk with our friend Beimnet right now about it. Let's hop right into it. Let's go now to our friend Beimnet Abebe from Galaxy Trading. As always, Beimnet, welcome back to Galaxy Brains.
Thanks for having me.
Wow, Fed Day, big day, Super Bowl. Was it a big day?
It was more like a divisional playoff round, arguably a wild card round, something like that.
So what did Jay come out and say? First of all, they held rates flat, right? So no change in rates. But what did they come out and say?
So the main thing that I was looking at today was the summary of economic projections. And there's three key areas: growth, unemployment, and inflation expectations, right? So to growth expectations, they slashed them, pretty meaningfully. I think 2025 growth was cut from like 2.2% GDP growth to 1.7. You also had an increase in the unemployment rate, expected unemployment rate from like 4.1 to 4.4. And you had inflation expectations also increase for core PCE. And so it really is a mixed picture. They're telling you that growth is going to be lower and unemployment is going to be higher, but that inflation's not going to come down as a result. And on top of that, the dot plot continued to suggest only 2 cuts this year. So it's a really strange mix of kind of inputs. And I think what it highlights is just the staggering level of uncertainty about policy on a go forward, right? The Trump administration is random at times and is very unpredictable. You're also, at a weird point in the business cycle, weird structural things happening in the economy where it's really hard to kind of forecast out what's going to happen on a go forward basis. And so, with the combination of fiscal policy uncertainty, geopolitical uncertainty, economic uncertainty, like it's just really hard to know what to do. And I think what the Fed did today was kind of give themselves optionality with respect to, how they're going to respond. The one thing of note as well was that they did reduce the pace of QT by 50%. That was a little bit of a surprise to markets. And the market reaction to this has been a little bit on the dovish side. You saw 2-year yields go from 4.08% to about 3.98%, so a rally of 10 basis points. And S&P rallied on the back of that, but really not a whole lot. And so the market perceived this as mildly risk positive. We'll see. It takes time for the market to digest information and really process it. But to be honest, I'm left with more questions than answers, truthfully. And, I think that's where a lot of investors, a lot of CEOs and CFOs, a lot of everyday people are. People are worried about losing their jobs. CEOs are worried about tariff policy and whether they should spend on capex. And so, I think this is just a very uncertain environment, and it's really hard to want to be gung-ho about risk if you just really don't know.
So you said it was staggering. You said the word staggering, which had me thinking of the word stagflation. Is that kind of what we're looking at here?
That is precisely what the data suggests. And one interesting anecdote. So I looked at where core PC has been for the past 5 years, right? The Fed's stated objective is 2% core PCE. The last time we were at 2% core PCE was March of 2021. We have sustained above the Fed's mandated target for 4 years. Right. And they're still telling you transitory. Mm-hmm. And you have this huge tariff deadline coming up, April 2nd. You have the last batch of UMISH data suggests that folks are expecting 4+% inflation on a 1 year basis. Right? And so it's really hard for me to view the Fed as that credible in terms of like meaningfully getting in or having a strong willingness to kind of commit to getting inflation down, right? And I think they're really scarred a little bit by kind of the policy mistakes over the past 5 years or so, right? Last year they cut rates by 100 basis points and rates went straight up, right? In post-COVID, they told you inflation was transitory, and it clearly wasn't. And so I think this is a Fed that is a little reluctant about getting too aggressive on hiking rates now. So it's a really complicated mix of market and economic conditions. And so I truthfully, I'm just going to stay data dependent.
Yeah,
like that's all you can do.
And this is causing chop, uncertainty. I mean, look at Bitcoin right over our shoulder here, 85K, right in the center of this 80 to 90 range. We've mostly been in the bottom part of that range, but again, pretty resilient. 82 feels like it's so far held. I know our friend Quinn Thompson thinks it's going down to 72. It's possible, right? But have you been surprised at all at like after that initial very scary drop from the 90s to like 79? Over the last, 2 weeks, we've basically been in the same, Bitcoin's been like a stablecoin at like 82 to 85. Like, is that expression of uncertainty here, or what is that?
I think, you just kind of might have run out of sellers, but I also don't think there's like a ton of buying flow that's coming, right? So far, the Trump administration policies on crypto have underwhelmed the market relative to expectations.
Right, which is crazy because they've been almost everything that crypto had asked for.
Which is what was baked into the price.
Yeah.
And so, I really do think that, like, without substantive buying flow coming, like, it's really hard to kind of sustain. Yeah. And personally, I'm still a little bit bearish on broader risk markets from a valuation standpoint, from a fiscal standpoint, where the Fed, where the government is trying to cut spending by $1 trillion a year.
You've said this, maybe almost certainly the correct long-term thing, but obviously just bearish for near-term everything.
And Scott Bessent, is not flinching on the market point.
Right.
Like, he continues to reiterate that, the markets will have a detox period. And I don't know how you can view that as being constructive for risk.
He's literally saying it's not.
It's not. Yeah. And so, you go back to, the whole idea of if stocks aren't doing well, like, why would one expect crypto to do well?
Be unlikely.
Yes.
Historically speaking.
Correct.
Maybe one day. It does actually feel like, this is what I mean though, like 85K, 82K, et cetera, feels like a pretty healthy Bitcoin price if you take all the policies that have happened and stack them and without the flows, even just the policies, and stack them on top of the prior all-time high in the low 70s from last year. That seems pretty reasonable. It turns out we know now there was about 20K of price froth related to the anticipation of the policies.
Yeah.
But 85K is still meaningfully higher year over year. It's also certainly, anyway.
Yeah, I would contrast that with the fact that gold is making fresh all-time highs.
Fair point.
Today as we speak.
Yeah.
Right? We are above $3,000 an ounce. There is strong buying flow from central banks. These aren't mon-pa retail. This is...
So they're buying gold and not treasuries, treasury notes, bills.
They are... I can't speak to exactly the foreign holdings.
But they are buying gold.
They are buying gold,
Yeah.
and it is sending it way higher in price. I think it's around 20 trillion in market cap.
But you've seen a little. You said,
be.
Well, we've talked a lot about, and a lot of people on Wall Street have talked about how they, Trump, and for a variety of reasons, wants to push rates down, so yields down, push yields down, right? And we haven't really seen it yet on the, right? Everyone's looking at the 10-year as the measure here, and it hasn't really come down that much, right?
Well, it did come down from like elevated levels like a couple months ago,
right? But yeah,
by and large, like 10s at 430, like that's not a meaningful reduction.
That's what I'm saying,
and that doesn't ease financial conditions. And so I think there's a long way to go in terms of them achieving their policy objectives. And if you really want to see 10-year yields at 3.5 to 375-ish. Like, you got a lot of wood to chop. You got to spend a lot less money. You got to fire more people.
Yeah, which is politically difficult. Very difficult.
Yeah. And to be honest, the one thing I keep thinking, and, our CEO was talking about it on his podcast, how are you going to do this without touching entitlements? Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, right? People, don't want that messed with.
Right. That's a lot of the spend.
It's a lot of the spend. But at the same time, we're spending $1 trillion a year to service the debt.
Right. Just interest.
Yeah. Right? And
not paying any principal down at all.
Right. And so I think we have to be realistic about what policy measures need to be used in order to actually achieve that outcome. And I think realistically it's every lever if you're trying to.
That's how big the problem is.
Yes. And it's going to be painful.
Yep. Well, that's it. We'll cut it there for now. My friend Beimnet Abebe from Galaxy Trading, thank you so much.
No problem.
Let's go now to our guest, Preston Pysh, well-known podcaster, general partner at Ego Death Capital. Preston, thank you so much for coming on Galaxy Brains.
Great to be here, Alex. Thanks for having me.
It's an exciting time in Bitcoin land.
It's a very confusing time.
It is confusing because you've got the fundamental government and regulatory catalyst very much in our favor, like more than it's ever been. We've never been this back, but also the macro situation is very tenuous, right?
Very.
And it's we're going to talk a lot about the SBR and Bitcoin, but I mean, literally every day I wake up the last month and a half and markets are terrified. Bitcoin markets, macro markets, TradFi equities are down, 10%, 12% from their all-time high. It's like the earth is collapsing if you watch CNBC.
I think everybody was expecting the markets to just continue to rage after the election. And then once Trump came into office, I think everybody just expected a similar playbook to what they saw during his first administration. And you've actually seen quite the opposite, where they're saying, yeah, we don't really care what the markets do. In the short term, we're playing a long-term game. They're trying to get the spending under control with all the Doge. And I think it was just a complete 180 to what everybody was anticipating. Not only that, they were talking a lot like we're going to start doing tariffs to offset income tax and a bunch of different ideas that people were looking at. They're looking at the charts. They're seeing where the dollar was at that time and thinking, okay, well, that's going to make the dollar just explode higher. It's done the opposite. It's sold off like crazy since he's come into office. And so I think there was just, in general, I would just say everybody's expectations, mine included, have just been really kind of a polar opposite of what has really kind of played out. So lots of confusion.
Yeah, and the president appears to be directly calling for short-term pain, not just tolerant of it, but actually doing it on purpose, right? Is that your view?
Yeah, and the narrative that I've heard, whether this is true or not, I don't know, but this is a narrative that I heard that I was kind of like, okay, maybe that could be it. If they are able to just kind of induce a liquidity crunch here at the beginning, they can kind of blame it on the past administration if they do it early enough, and then they can kind of come in with the fire hose and reflate everything. So that's something I heard. Whether there's any validity to that or not, I don't know, but yeah, it's just been now to kind of counter that point. I've seen this chart going around where there's global liquidity that's been added into the system, and the lag to it is, call it 45 to 60 days before it starts to take effect. And when you look at them coming into office, a lot of that liquidity started to be added immediately after they came in. So that kind of offsets the narrative that I just said. I don't know what to expect, but I'm sure you've seen the chart, or there's other people that are showing this chart that, this is what's going to make Bitcoin rip and equity markets rip or whatever. But we'll see. We'll see what's happening.
Yeah, the global M2 chart you're talking about, I've seen that as well. I'm not an expert in this by any means, but I've heard smart people explain that actually M2 isn't even the proper metric to look at for global liquidity because bank deposits aren't like the primary source of bank liquidity anymore. But yeah, it does feel like they are the part of the narrative I've heard, not just that they want to blame it on the Biden administration, which you're right. I've actually we've seen that, to be clear. Like, their spokespeople have come out and blamed to the extent they've commented at all on markets, which they're trying really hard not to. And to your point, right? Trump said, I'm not even looking at the stock market, right? Like, I wonder how long that can hold. At some point, if it's down 20%, like at some point, I don't know, but it does feel like they're trying to, they need to refi the debt to term it out longer. They want the longer term debt rates to go down. And one way to do that is to beat down risk assets, basically, they think. It hasn't really worked yet. If you look at the 10-year, it's not really down that much, the rate, the yield. Not much.
Well, I think the thing that's rarely discussed is how much they have to refinance in the coming 12 months.
$7 trillion, I saw. $7 trillion.
Yeah, that's the number. Yeah, $7 trillion. And so when you think about the size, how big is $7 trillion? I mean, the debt load, how much they're going to spend in the coming years, what, $9 trillion? So almost all of what they spend in the coming year, they've got to put on the charge card effectively, right?
Yeah, it's crazy.
It'd be like you outspending your entire income plus 20% or whatever. And everything that you're spending there has to go on like overnight money type charges. So they're trying to bring those interest rates down with some of these actions. And from my understanding, the way that they're making the dollar weaken, because it makes no sense to me at all how they're weakening the dollar in the face of all this tariff talk. And so you start doing tariffs, man, your local currency should absolutely rip. And it's done literally the polar opposite. So my understanding is that the way that they're doing this is they're almost threatening all these other countries with tariffs, with like almost getting them to reshore their capital investments overseas. And by doing that, they're selling off U.S. assets, and that's what's causing the weakness in the dollar. How long that can last, I don't know. But it's pretty miraculous that they've been able to get the dollar to weaken. I can only imagine how much stiffer this sell-off would be in risk-on assets if the dollar wasn't weakening simultaneously and it was actually going up. So, and this goes back to the original point, which is this is all very confusing, because for anybody that's studied macro for even a short amount of time, they'd be looking at this and saying, this makes no sense. How the hell in the world are they doing this?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know how long they can do this. I don't know how long this forcing foreign countries to reshore their capital is going to continue to create dollar weakness. But I would imagine once that incentive wears out, which I don't think it would last that long. I might be wrong. I have no idea. That it's again going to be very confusing what happens in the markets. Let me say one other thing here really fast. One thing that I've learned about Bitcoin through all these years is when you go onto Twitter and you're just full of rage to talk about how awesome your trade is going or your investment is going, that is usually a time to like maybe throttle back a bit. And when everybody's dunking on you, like the Peter Schiffs and the Mike Greens and all those types of people are like dunking on you, which would be, I would say, right about now. Maybe it might have to get a little bit worse, but when they start dunking on you, that is exactly the moment you want to lean into this and gobble up as many coins as you can. I've seen it so many times, and it is such a great indicator. And I mean, I'm not trying to tell people to. I've just seen it play out so many times that in those moments, it is such a strong indicator as to like kind of where you're at.
Yeah.
But anyway, sorry.
I agree. I mean, you're right. Like, think of like the inauguration, right? Like, it's this. So you've got November election and then January inauguration, and in between those, Bitcoin just absolutely rips from 60 to 110, right?
Yeah.
And there's a giant pile of unknown positive catalysts, or like, right? Like we know that like there's a bunch of good stuff coming, but we have no specifics, right? And so it's very clear, like buy the rumor, sell the news type of trade that, and this happens all the time. Same thing with the ETFs, multi-month drumbeat. We know they're coming. When they finally come, they did end up being incredibly bullish. I mean, shocking amount of inflows ultimately, but still though, like, the market,
there was months. What was it, like 2 months, where it went sideways and slightly down?
Well, dude, it was March of 24 until November. It was 237 days between all-time highs. A giant, long-ass consolidation, right? With a fair amount of volatility, right? Like there was some time. I think it traded as low as like 49K during that Japan carry trade unwind in August, and as high as 69K. So like giant volatility in there too, but basically just sideways for, I don't know, 7 months.
I mean, I remember around Christmas, this past Christmas, and there was talk of the SBR. You got this, you went from the war and crypto army to literally the polar opposite setup, and it hit like 108. And I'm looking at the charts. I'm saying this thing's just going to just go to 150 or whatever within months. And lo and behold, look what happened. So, I mean, it's very humbling. This is the thing that I've learned through all the years of being in it. It's very humbling. Like when you just feel like there's absolutely nothing that can stop this thing. It just, for whatever reason, figures out a way to take a breather. So, yeah.
I know. And you're right that the macro right now, it feels like just a macro story here. Obviously the setup for Bitcoin on a fundamental level is better than it's ever been. So, I agree. I mean, I think if you have a long-term investment horizon, it makes a lot of sense to be adding Bitcoin when it's down. I mean, that's like, right. I mean, and again, it's not an investment advice and whatnot, but I'm just saying, like, to your point, like empirically speaking, thinking back, when you have such a positive foundation, literally, and we'll talk about this, but literally the president is saying there's Bitcoin and there's everything else in crypto, literally, which is actually crazy that they came out, and it's awesome. It's true, I think, but it's also shocking. It's official government policy in the United States. But yeah, you've got it trading like NASDAQ, basically. Like it's trading like a risk asset. Everybody was selling everything, basically. Gold is held up a little bit, but there have been some days over the last couple of weeks when literally everything sold off, and like gold, Bitcoin, risk assets, everything. People are just selling everything and raising cash, right? Like,
which is a liquidity. Yeah.
They're just looking at the situation saying it's really uncertain. We don't know what's going to happen. And, for the first time in 50 plus years, the president is beating the market down. Right. And so you're just like, I don't know what I'm meant to own in the short term, if you're a short term trader. And I am forced to comment and do work on short term ideas as well. Let's talk about the SBR, because this is actually crazy. I was telling people I've been a skeptic, both that it should and would happen. Right. And officially, I put out some predictions December 31st for this year. And one of them was that the government would hold but not buy Bitcoin. That basically I was saying I'm short SBR, right? Now that's just mostly for fun. In the scheme of things, I don't actually care. It was more just like everyone in my world is calling for it. Like, why don't I be the be a cold, if I say it's going to happen, like that's not interesting from a prediction, in my opinion. But also, the president never said this. I give a lot of credit for David Bailey and others for basically incepting this idea. Like, I was there in Nashville, you were there. The president didn't say this. He said, "Never sell your Bitcoin, national Bitcoin stockpile." That's what he said. And then, of course, right after his speech, Senator Cynthia Lummis came out and introduced her act, the Bitcoin Act, which absolutely does say buy Bitcoin. But like that was it. There was never the president never actually said he would do this. But yet last week, we got it, basically.
Yeah.
What do you make of that?
I think he surrounded himself with just a bunch of hardcore maxis. I mean, you look at RFK's speech in Nashville, and I mean, it was a rager. He was saying he wanted to buy 4 million Bitcoin and put them on it was quite the rager. And so, I mean, you have people like him that I think Trump really respects. I think every major person on his staff has a pretty significant Bitcoin position. And I think that they have a lot of conviction in this. So I think him just kind of being around them, I think he has to have his foot to the ground on the social media standpoint, just like hearing the feedback. And I think most people were pretty upset with the lack of action that he took after he was elected with respect to Bitcoin. And I think they saw it. And yeah, so the thing that I think is a way bigger point to this than them even doing it is just the fact that the spillover effect into other states, into other countries. Because think about it, if you're in whatever country of the world and you say the U.S. just stood up a strategic Bitcoin reserve, whether they buy a bunch of coins or not, the fact that they even have one is a major discussion point. Like, this is the country with the strongest, currency in the world, and they're doing this. This doesn't, like, why? What in the world, right? I think that discussion point and that almost like mind virus is huge, like massive when it comes to just global adoption. And that's something that's going to take time to kind of play out. It might take 2, 3, 4 years to really kind of take hold for a lot of other countries. And from my understanding, there's other countries that are already doing this in addition to the U.S. So I think that that's really important. I think that we're going to have something passed in Texas for the state government as far as an SBR. And so you're just seeing it slowly take hold. And I honestly think this is way bigger news than people are giving it credit for. You have a lot of people that are arguing whether this is a good thing or a bad thing because the government's involved. And like when you look at Bitcoin, the ethos of what Bitcoin represented, which was separation of state and money. This is my take on it. One of the things I heard very early on was Bitcoin is for your enemies. Bitcoin is for anybody that wants to participate in it. And there's nothing you can do about them participating in it. That's why it is what it is. Because if let's say you had a bunch of cypherpunks that say, you know what, we don't want the government to have this, and actually had the ability to stop the government from using it, that in and of itself is the issue with money and control and centralization. So my take on it is, hey, Bitcoin's for your enemies. And if you're looking at the state and saying, hey, I don't want them to use it, well, you're just not even understanding the first principles of what Bitcoin is from the start. Now, I think where a lot of people are voicing their frustration is all the people that are cheering on and acting like our only hope is if the government adopts it. And I agree with that crowd. Like, we don't need the U.S. to adopt this. This thing's going to go off on its own trajectory, regardless of whether the U.S. or any other country adopts it. I think that what changes potentially is just the pace of it kind of becoming the new global reserve settlement layer. If you start getting a bunch of governments to lean into this, I think that timeline of it becoming the global reserve asset really just accelerates. It just all speeds up. And if they don't, then it just takes a little bit longer.
I think that's right. I think it is, you can't stop anyone from using it. I agree. And by the way, that's its value proposition. It's core to the value. I mean, if you could, then it wouldn't be valuable, right? Like, and I think, it is a good question. Like, is this what Satoshi would have wanted? By the way, I don't actually give a shit what Satoshi did or didn't want anymore at this point. Like, I mean, it's important to know about the foundation and founding of the system and why it was created and for what purpose. But again, this thing is out there. It's open source. Anyone can do it. It's not like Satoshi, I think, would not want to be a dictator of how the network is used. But, I agree with what you said a lot. Bitcoin doesn't need this. Maybe the governments of the world need it more than Bitcoin needs it. I think
no doubt about that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean,
Yeah.
But this is why I've been one of the reasons I've been a skeptic of the SBR is mostly just to tell people, like, dude, you don't need this to happen to buy it. Like, it's more about tempering market expectations around it than actually being against it. It's more like there's tons of good reasons to own Bitcoin. This doesn't have to be the only one, right? For the market to be fixated on when is the government going to buy Bitcoin, I don't think is necessary.
If I have to be honest, it's happened a lot faster. The timeline of government's interest happened way faster than I kind of anticipated. I kind of suspected that they were going to be much slower to understand it. It's more of a function of how destroyed the fixed income markets are and how the sovereign debt markets are such a disaster that it's forced them to look at it this way.
Yeah, it is.
They had
it
to
is
come up with a solution. Yeah.
The debt situation is super bad. Here's what I think about the SBR2. So the president signs this order, and it's called Establishing a Strategic Bitcoin Reserve and a United States Digital Asset Stockpile. And we literally got the government, the White House, saying that it is official government policy that Bitcoin is different than altcoins, literally. And Bitcoin, he has ordered the government to never sell and explore strategies for buying. That's what they're ordered to do that. And then for the rest of crypto, he's ordered for them to hold it, but prohibited them from buying. Literally, the order prohibits them from buying altcoins and effectively puts the management of the stockpile in the Treasury's hands. So basically, altcoins are in sell-only mode. They don't have to sell, but they can't buy. So the only management they can do of the portfolio is selling. And it's the reverse for Bitcoin, and that is official government policy. But if those strategies to buy have to be budget neutral, like, which makes sense. You can't, this is where I think the real question is, like, how would the government buy Bitcoin? Do you have any ideas about how?
Well, did you see Alex Leishman's comment over the weekend that River clients are the people that are already buying neutral? I forget the terminology that you just said.
Budget neutral.
Thank you. Budget neutral Bitcoin, because they're putting cash on deposit, just like a bank earning interest, and then they're taking the interest and buying Bitcoin with the interest. So I don't know if the U.S. could finagle something out of that terminology and somehow buy it that way as they're waiting or keeping working capital. And I don't know how the government treats working capital, right? I mean, do they just print that? How does that work at the Treasury? I don't know, but it's an interesting idea that if they are collecting interest on working capital, couldn't they just take that interest and plow it into Bitcoin, and that would be treated as neutral? But I don't know. It's a terminology. It's a lawyer game, to your point. Yeah.
I think my question is similar, and it's sort of like in an environment where the president, for the first time in decades, is actually trying to reduce the deficit and maybe even ultimately reduce the national debt, which is incredible, by the way. I mean, look, it's going to be painful. Like, it's nice that for once, I mean, think about other countries like Russia and China. They take like multi-decade views. Our political system makes it impossible to do that. But you've effectively got a second-term president with nothing to lose who's really going for it. And I look, it might not work. Honestly, I probably bet that it doesn't work long term.
Yeah, I don't think it works.
But like, I respect the effort and the try here. But if you buy Bitcoin, in almost any way, you have to sell USD, like, effectively. And so if there is any budget neutral money to be found, it could be politically difficult to, instead of paying down the debt or paying down the deficit, to buy Bitcoin, right? Like, like in any case, like, so to me, it's quite difficult for them to figure out how to actually buy any Bitcoin here, like, politically speaking.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think you're going to have a huge uphill education burden to figure out ways to justify that to the general public, because I think most people are just looking at it and saying, yeah, he's just appeasing his voter base that helped get him into office by doing these types of things. And they're fine with it as long as it's not involving, hold on, we just saved all this money and we're not going to pay down the deficit. Like, that doesn't make any sense to your everyday person, right?
Right. Or you just laid off all these people in XYZ government department, and instead of paying them, you're going to buy Bitcoin, right? Seems a little weird. This is why I think one of the simplest ideas, by the way, is take some of those altcoins that are in sell-only mode and sell them and buy Bitcoin, right? Like, that's assets the government doesn't even really know that it has, right? Like, nobody knows. And one of the ones I've been targeting as my big idea is BNB. We think the government has like $23 million of BNB. And it's obviously Binance. I mean, no hate for Binance, but it's obviously not an American company, like, at its core. So sell the foreign altcoin to buy the Bitcoin, right? Like, it's actually a swap. Like, it's something they currently have. It's one idea. I mean, people have talked about a lot of other interesting things, like, in particular, like, stuff the government has on its balance sheet, right? So, like, they have land. Nobody wants national parks to be sold for any real purpose, to be clear. But, like, they have a bunch of defunct government buildings that are empty, right? Sell some buildings and do something with it. But again, putting the proceeds from sales of government buildings into Bitcoin rather than just paying down the deficit or closing the deficit and paying down the debt seems tricky. But I will say I was incredibly surprised and impressed where this Bitcoin maxi and altcoin sell only actually landed. Like, you had like Brian Armstrong calling for a Bitcoin only SBR, right? Like, the thing got actually, like, somehow the Overton window moved exactly where David Bailey had been planning it.
Yeah. It was very weird to see Brian. I think when he was out at Davos, I saw he was talking just basically Bitcoin and not anything else. And I was like, so what does this guy really think? Because I just watched him for the last, call it 6 years, not even utter the word of Bitcoin, almost like it was the name that shall not be mentioned, to what appeared to be like a Bitcoin maxi narrative. I was very confused.
Yeah, and Anatoly, the founder of Solana, was forced to come out for no SBR, none at all, right? Even though Sol had been mentioned, it became, like, politically unpalatable to suggest that his own coin would be part of a reserve. Like, the Overton window moved directly in favor of a Bitcoin only SBR. It's wild that happened. And yes, Tyler and Cameron, same thing. We know they're big Bitcoiners. They bought a ton of Bitcoin. They're OG Bitcoiners. But Gemini is a crypto exchange. Like, they have significant interest in altcoins also. And yet they work, Jesse Powell, same thing. Kraken, Gemini, Coinbase founders all came out basically for a Bitcoin only SBR.
One thing that I think is also not discussed as to, like, how this will really kind of start percolate up to the federal level from like an execution standpoint. So, like, all your point that you're making really is they did it administratively, but, like, to actually put it into action and to buy and, like, use it in a way that would be meaningful and constructive, like, you're very suspect of whether that can happen. And I would agree with you at this point right now. Where I think that you're going to see the incentive to use it at the federal level is through demonstrating it at a state level. And I think once we have a state that almost micro-strategies the state, call it Texas or Wyoming or wherever, either through the SBR, through Bitcoin-backed bonds, municipality bonds that have Bitcoin backing to them, and you put on this clinic of, look, we were in financial trouble here at the local municipality or at the state, whatever, at state whatever. look how we were able to get ourselves in a completely different trajectory. And you kind of have this happening with El Salvador as far as how they've implemented their Bitcoin position and how they're able to. I mean, this is a whole nother topic in discussion of like what's really happening there with the IMF, but I'm using it more as a point to kind of demonstrate once we get a state or a municipality that's putting on a clinic as to how they got themselves out of financial trouble by heavily leaning into Bitcoin, I don't think that you're going to see a lot of movement at a very high federal level, at least here in the United States. In another country, you might see another El Salvador kind of scenario play out. And that would also be demonstrative to the US to maybe lean into it more. But I think we need more expecting these politicians on a net basis to academically understand something and implement it, I think is way less likely than them seeing proof through other countries or local municipalities' actions to then start implementing it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I think you're right. I think, well, we have a federalist society, which means, for people who don't remember the Federalist Papers, that actually means not the federal government, right? Federalism is the dissipation of power across the states. And the idea was that states would be petri dishes for policies in general. And ultimately the good policies would be proven and bubble up. And I think you make a great point about someone else. The U.S. federal government's probably not going to lead on this issue, right? But if they see it working, then maybe they will finally get in. I mean, I know they're, like I said, that they're not ordered to buy, but they are ordered to examine buying, right? Figure out if they should buy, to develop, strategies to acquire budget neutral Bitcoin. I think there's going to be a lot of work on it. I mean, dude, how far have we come? This is crazy that we're even talking about this. It's actually shocking.
It is kind of crazy. And one other thing that if I was going to argue with my point, the fact that you have, who's the cantor?
Howard
the
Lutnick.
Commerce Secretary.
Yeah, Howard Lutnick.
Thank you. The fact that you have Howard, who, I mean, he's basically been custodying all the treasuries on behalf of Tether all these years. He's said he has over hundreds of millions of dollars in Bitcoin. The fact that you have him close by, you have many other people that are just hardcore Bitcoiners. Maybe the incentives around the administration is that they do lean into this and put on the clinic that we're both a little suspect that they're going to do. But I think that's another really important point to understand is I think that that decision makers are, and you see this with the Treasury Secretary's comments, that they're seeing that the only real free and open market buyer is stablecoin issuers to buy up the sovereign debt, and they're highly incentivized to do it, especially at these interest rates. And so by tokenizing sovereign debt and then seeing how important that is to just kind of keep the liquidity flowing, to not be reliant on yourself buying back your own issuance, call it QE. I think that's also kind of like this aha moment, like, oh, wow, this is kind of interesting. And the more that takes hold, which the trajectories are strongly suggesting that there's just going to be more and more market demand for this type of activity, the more it really kind of indoctrinates or entrenches itself into the global financial system. And I think that this is really, I think the whole stablecoin thing is really important. And I think it's really important for the continued growth of a natural continued growth of the dollar, which it has to keep expanding. So it's kind of this really weird match made in heaven relationship where they have to start embracing this stuff. They have to start, these rails are all interconnected once you start going into like tokenized dollars. And Howard has had a front row seat to this for years at this point.
Yeah, it does represent the intersection of stablecoins and Bitcoin for sure. He said in Nashville last summer in his panel or whatever, his talk, He said that he and other Cantor executives own shitloads of Bitcoin, and then he made AP correct the story, and he said, "I didn't say shitloads, I said shed loads." And I was like, pretty sure you said shitloads, but I don't know what a shed load is, but I agree it's a lot, right?
But Alex, this is the part that I think is going to be extra demonstrative for Wall Street banks. When they look at Tether and they look at, I mean, everybody has this talking point, and it's true. Tether had more profits last year than BlackRock. Okay. So that in and of itself is like the first light bulb that goes off. You're like, what? Say that again? Like, really? Then I think the next point is, well, what did they do with all their retained earnings? Oh, they basically bought Bitcoin with all their retained earnings. What did you say their balance sheet was for, like, shareholder equity? Not the amount outstanding that's representing all the tokens, but their shareholder equity of the company. What did you say that was last year? Oh, it was, however many billions. What's it 4 years from now? It's going to be miraculous to watch the shareholder equity growth of Tether. I can't even imagine what that number is going to be, because they're sweeping everything into Bitcoin.
I know I think if we listen and trust their attestation or whatever from December, I actually looked at this a couple days ago for a different reason. They have like $7 billion of Bitcoin on their balance sheet.
Yeah. And so if we 4x from here, right? Could you imagine what that would take from a shareholder or from a net income standpoint to grow your shareholder equity at that pace that they're going to put on? I mean, it's going to be unimaginable what their shareholder equity is.
I mean, it's going to be one of the biggest companies in the world. The only other stuff, by the way, that they've been doing other than buy Bitcoin is like buying like pharmaceutical companies and agricultural concerns across Latin America. This is a genuine like global conglomerate level company at this point, right? So and I do like your point about Bitcoin and stablecoins being adjacent. This is what Michael Saylor argues as well, that like stablecoin explosion can be additive and Bitcoin growth can happen together, that you've got the digital currency that is stablecoins and the digital capital that is Bitcoin growing together, right? And it's quite fascinating too, because I think there's a lot of political fear that like Bitcoin being government policy would harm the dollar, but we're actually saying, no, dude, like grow the dollar, grow the shit out of the dollar, like put the dollar in everyone's hands through these stable coins, pay for the debt, and then also make Bitcoin the new gold. That's kind of what where the political pathway is to supporting both.
People that and you've heard this from, I think, Mark Goodwin and Whitney Webb. They're raising this, major concern about stable coins, that you're basically having a central bank digital currency in disguise by pushing it into the private sector. And to be quite honest with you, I agree with that narrative, right? If the government wants to go in there and shut down an account, they can tap on the shoulder of any one of these stable coins that are being issued and say, we don't like that account. I think that's all valid. But the only thing that I would push back on or talk to is, how did you think this was all going to end? How did you think Bitcoin was going to run to $1 million, $10 million per coin without the dollar expanding like crazy? That's the only way that Bitcoin runs to those levels, is by having the dollar, the euro, every one of these fiat currencies continue to expand at a breakneck pace. So then the question becomes, well, how can they even how can they keep expanding it like that? In my opinion, you have to do some form of stable coin. You have to tokenize it. You can't have it sitting there with no bid because there's no real buyer of it, right? This is the mechanism that almost has to play out. And it's not like you or me or anybody has the capacity to step in there and say, no, we're going to vote against this. That's not a viable thing, right? So I'm just looking at it and saying, this is the inevitable direction that this all has to go. They have to keep expanding the debt, because if they don't, then you get massive deflation, right? So what is the mechanical way that you can keep expanding dollars and euros and fiat into the system other than tokenizing it? you have to tokenize it.
Yeah, it's going to be, I think it's quite interesting. I agree. I think you're right. Before we wrap, Preston, I want to ask you about Ego Death Capital and what you guys are doing there. It's a Bitcoin focused venture investment firm, right? Tell me about Ego Death.
Yeah, we're just looking at the expansion of all of everything that's happening with Bitcoin and, basically the dematerialization of traditional finance built on these old legacy dollar rails, and saying we think Bitcoin's going to be at the heart of all of it, and that everything that we've been talking about on the show, that that trend continues to push into further and further Bitcoin adoption. There's going to be new companies that are building around this new technology. We want to make investments in those companies and lead the charge from an infrastructure standpoint of like what needs to be built. We think it's still a little early for Bitcoin payments obviously it's taking off in some areas, but not at a pace that is, you're not in the S curve where everybody's using Bitcoin for payments, but we think that that's going to happen. We think that it's going to come, maybe in 4 to 8 years, you're going to really see that start to pick up in developed economies first before it gets to advanced economies like ours that we're operating in. But there's going to be companies that service a lot of this and make it accessible and easy to use, turnkey kind of ways where people don't even really necessarily understand the technology that's happening in the background, but they do understand that they're not getting debased at 50% or higher a year in their local currency terms, and they can just go out and use it with any kind of smartphone technology. And we're just trying to make investments into anything that touches Bitcoin from an equity standpoint. We're trying to make investments in those companies.
Very cool. And have you seen growth in the Bitcoin venture entrepreneurship space like lately? Because there's a ton of crypto VC.
Yeah, there is.
And I've done venture in this space for a long time as well, and it's been hard to allocate to Bitcoin through venture. There just hasn't been, you've got some brokerages, some custody and self-custody companies, right? You've got Bitcoin miners, which aren't really great for VC money, in my opinion. It's it's just very capital intensive, right? But I feel like that has evolved. Finally, there's more. You've got incubators like at NYDIG and elsewhere that are surfacing and creating more Bitcoin entrepreneurship opportunities. Like, what's the landscape look like? Is it growing?
So I would say that to build on Bitcoin is very challenging. To find something that has a competitive moat that will be sustained, that you're generating profits. To date, where you've seen a lot of that happen is in exchanges and derivatives exchanges that are profitable and that have figured out a way to make money around, selling Bitcoin to customers. Where I think it goes next, and to your point, that is pretty small. It's not really big. And for us, we just haven't raised a ton of money because we just don't think that the sizing is there. Are we going out and raising $1 billion fund? Of course not, because how would you even deploy $1 billion fund in this space? Because of the companies that are actually viable, that are actually building something that's valuable to the user, valuable to the company itself, and that has the potential to kind of protect some of that into the coming 10 years. So we look at it and we're saying the sizing there needs to be a pretty small fund, and that's what we are. We're not a huge fund. As the companies get bigger, you get into Series A, Series Bs. Maybe you need to raise a little bit more than what you do in seed rounds. But in general, it's a pretty small space for Bitcoin only, because we're just not going to lean into crypto rug pull technology. We think that it's unethical. We think that it's somewhat of a cancer to the space, and we're just not going to participate in it. So we just kind of keep the fund a little bit smaller and just look for the great builders, the great ideas behind value accretive ideas in businesses.
Well, Preston, that sounds exciting. Congrats on Ego Death, which I know is relatively new. You guys, over the last year, I think, founded it maybe a year ago, if I recall.
Yeah, we're I think at 3 years now.
No way, is that true?
Yeah,
Time is really a flat circle at this point. Yeah. I remember when you guys announced it, I thought that was a year ago. Apparently, it was 3 years ago.
It moves fast.
Well, congratulations on everything you're building, and I mean, we could go on and on with our Bitcoin conversation, but let's wrap it here. And did a cool 40 minutes. And thank you so much, Preston Pysh, for coming on Galaxy Brains.
Thanks, Alex.
That's it for this week's episode of Galaxy Brains. Thanks to our guest Preston Pysh from the Bitcoin Fundamentals podcast and Ego Death Capital, and our friend Beimnet Abebe from Galaxy Trading. As always, everyone have a safe and happy weekend, and we will see you next week. Thanks for listening to Galaxy Brains, the weekly podcast from Galaxy Research. If you enjoy the show, please like, rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. To follow Galaxy Research, sign up for our weekly newsletter at gdr.email, read our content at galaxy.com/research, and follow us on Twitter at GLXYResearch. See you next week.